The rest of the council?
Oh, no, that goes under.
Yeah.
Okay, so.
So then maybe let's you. Hey, how are you? Earlier. I was just like, yeah. And you maybe. To see it. Yeah, perfect. You know what? Sorry, apologies.
I just sent mine.
Hi. We just
No, but I can put it
There's
here.
some room. There's enough chairs. Okay. Yeah, that's okay. Yeah. So that's some water. Okay. You need water. This section. Do you want to sit here? No. Okay.
You want me to leave it here for you at the end for the question and answers?
And then we just keep on
Or the-
hurting people when we throw it.
I can give you when you whatever. Yeah.
So we start with I think we have everyone. Huh? I don't see her, so I assume she can't make it. And that's okay. Yeah. Is this working? No. Should we use that one? Okay. That one? Okay. So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this side event. My name is Katrina Rao, and I work as a researcher with Human Rights Watch, focusing on climate change and environmental health. And it's a real pleasure to be here today with a panel, with a large panel of excellent speakers that I will introduce to you in a second. I wanted to just briefly, as an introduction, reference the event that just happened here previously in this room that also focused on the impacts of climate change on human rights. It was an event hosted by the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights, and we had as speakers in this event, we had both the Patricia Espinosa, the head of the UN Secretariat, and also Ambassador Khan, who is going to be the part of the presidency of the COP, the upcoming COP. And I think that's really an important sign for all of us who are in this room, who have been working on human rights in climate action, that now there is really high-level support for that issue. So for those of you who are maybe new to this discussion and who haven't been in the previous panel, I wanted to give a quick introduction to the work and then to this panel, and then I'll hand it over to our speakers. So we are co-hosting this event called Delivering on Paris, Combating Climate Change While Protecting Rights, along with the Center for International Environmental Law. And we have, over the past few years, worked together with a coalition of civil society groups from different constituencies and indigenous peoples here at the UNFCCC to highlight the importance of human rights in these negotiations. And in 2015, in the Paris Agreement, there was, for the first time in the history of international environmental agreements, an explicit reference to human rights and related principles. And we'll talk more about the different elements that form part of these principles later in the discussion today. So now, of course, we are asking a different question. We have this reference to human rights in the Paris Agreement, and now the next question needs to be: how can we ensure that this reference is not just lip service on paper, but it actually drives the implementation of the Paris Agreement? And this is really the discussion that we would like to have here in the panel, and then later in the Q&A with all of you. And we are very excited that this event here is also webcast. So we even have people watching and listening online. So hopefully the discussions here can go much beyond the space and the people who are already in the room. So with that, I wanted to introduce our first speaker, Julio, who came here, who's from the works with the government of Chile, and who came here to give us a bit of an overview of his thoughts on how human rights could be integrated in the implementation. Basically, you know, looking kind of global picture, what could be entry points. Thanks for being here, Julio.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to speak in this event. I think that in the very intense negotiations that we are facing in this session, I think we forget one of our main drives for getting a new climate agreement in Paris, which was precisely to bring climate action down to the actual needs of people. And although nowadays with all this great amount of work that we are facing, we might, you know, forget the whole point of all this. When we were in Paris, we had a very determined mind in order to get what we wanted, which was the recognition that of the relationship between climate change and human rights, and to see that reflected explicitly in the Paris Agreement. That was a long battle. It was hard. It was not easy, as many of you recognize and say. Maybe this is the first time ever that an international agreement on human rights or on climate change recognizes human rights. We had some precedents, of course, especially from Cancun and other examples that made that connection outside of the convention. But the convention in general, historically, was very reluctant to accept that connection, and I think that was a great victory. And it was forged not only by governments and parties, but also in a very close partnership with non-state actors, and I think that was crucial to get what we achieved in Paris. So now we have a hook, a very important hook, and we need to build on top of that. We didn't get as far as getting human rights language in the body of the text, but we do have a very powerful preamble that talks about human rights, and that, I think, it's one element that we need to consider when we define strategies in order to continue promoting human rights in the climate action in our own initiatives for climate change. And I say this because as much as we recognize the importance of the mention of human rights in the preamble, there are also very important hooks that within the text of the Paris Agreement that talk about specific human rights that might not refer to human rights as an expression, but they address specific human rights. And I'm going to just give you one example that I'm sure you're familiar with. That refers to Article 7 in the Paris Agreement, what refers to adaptation, and that says that party acknowledge that adaptation actions should follow a country-driven, gender-responsive, participatory, and fully transparent approach, taking into consideration vulnerable groups, communities, and ecosystems, that should be based on and guided by the best available science and, as appropriate, traditional knowledge of indigenous people, and local knowledge systems, with a view to integrating adaptation into relevant socioeconomic and environmental policies and actions where appropriate. So this is a very general language, as the Paris Agreement is a very general agreement, but this is also a very important first step that could lead us into, into a more refined work, and to dig deep into each one of these elements that I just read. And this is just an example. because as we were discussing before, the APA also provides opportunities to do that. And one of the original new animals that was born with the Paris Agreement is the nationally determined contribution, which is the expression of climate action. So I believe that as an element of the APA agenda is precisely one of the sort of battlegrounds that we need to delve into when we try to reflect human rights and climate change. So just help countries to understand how they can actually commit themselves to climate goals and contributions that consider human rights, that are consistent with the obligations of parties in human rights international agreements, and in general that are active in that promotion. So I guess and this is going to be very hard or very easy. The hard part is when we are not able to bring that general principle-based speech into a concrete policy measures and policy actions. And so if we are able to help countries and to help especially developing parties to integrate a human rights vision into the policy definitions and implementation, that will be that will help a lot and will make easier for parties to introduce human rights language in their NDCs, which is, I guess, at the end of the day, the final frontier of what we can achieve in this regard. And this is I'm not just inventing. It's not out of the blue, because this goes very much in line with what the evolution of the negotiations have been in the last few months or the last 2 years since Paris, because the Paris Agreement is a very general agreement that needs a lot of work, as we are seeing now. We need MPGs, modalities, procedures, and guidelines, and this is what we're negotiating now. And I think the same thing should apply to human rights. We already have the recognition that is very wide and needs to be refined, and we need now to get some granularity in this. We need to understand what do we mean by respecting and promoting human rights in the climate action. So it makes sense now to take maybe more concrete or more specific steps in the promotion of particular human rights. And there are very good examples that very recently have been made available to parties, like the report on health issues related to climate change that was released last year by the WHO, or the recent report by the Nairobi World Programme on health issues. And there is a mandate for continuing working on that. And I think parties feel comfortable with this discussing specific human rights like the right to health. And this is interesting because these kind of report and these kind of conversations speak directly to national policies, which again are the basis for new NDCs that are going to be hopefully more ambitious in terms of human rights. The last thing I wanted to say is that for example, in the case of Chile, we are one of the few countries in the world that, along with Mexico probably, that included reference to short-lived pollutants in our NDCs. And this is interesting because these are new subjects, new frontiers of action. And for example, short-lived pollutants are very much related with the structure of production based on the intensive use of fossil fuels, and shifting that production goes, of course, is pointing in the direction of mitigation, but at the same time has very concrete co-benefits for human health, for the health of communities, and for in general for public health. So this is just an example that I want to give. I'm not going to go into details on that because this is not the purpose of this side event, and I probably go far beyond the time that I expected to use. So I will leave it as that, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Julio, for starting us off on this discussion, for all these insights and concrete steps that parties could take to integrate human rights in climate action here at the negotiations, but also at the domestic level. And that is a very good transition for our next speaker, who is part of the coalition of civil society and indigenous peoples who are here on this panel, who have worked together on very specific, to develop very specific recommendations on how human rights could be integrated in the context of the Paris Rulebook. So what specifically parties could do in the current negotiations about the APA on how to integrate human rights. So that there was a mention in what you said, Julio, where you talked about the reference that we have in the currently in the Paris Agreement is in the preamble. One thing that is, I think, important to mention in that context is that even though the reference in the Paris Agreement is only in the preamble, all the parties that are here at the parties to the UNFCCC have also ratified at least one, most of them, many more human rights treaties. So these are already domestic obligations. So we're really not talking about new obligations, but about bringing the existing frameworks together. And so with that, I would like to turn it over to Tonya, who works with CARE and has been part of this coalition focusing on food security. And Tonya will also talk about gender and how this could be brought into these negotiations.
Great, thank you, Katerina, and thank you to Human Rights Watch and the Center for International Environmental Law for having CARE join the panel. For those of you who don't know CARE, we are a development and humanitarian organization founded in 1945, delivering care packages to Europe in the aftermath of World War II. We now work in over 90 countries, covering areas across the spectrum of humanitarian and development issues, including agriculture. And we do place a special focus on working alongside women and girls because we recognize not only that there is a entrenched issue of gender inequality, but also recognizing the power that women have, women and girls, to lift themselves and their families and communities out of poverty. The Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals both recognize the disproportionate impact of climate change on women and girls. Women and girls often have unequal access to education, to resources, whether it's financial services, land tenure, extension services, if they're farmers. And they also lack equal access to decision-making at all levels, from the household to the national level to global level. They also, within their households, because of traditional roles, often carry a disproportionate labor burden, covering both household well-being, caring for children and the elderly, fetching water, taking different products to market, just tending for general needs around the household. At the same time, and oftentimes because of some of the roles that they play, women and girls have very unique knowledge that they can bring to the table, whether it's about household well-being and nutrition and health, whether it's about water resources or different techniques that they can take at the household level to increase their resilience. The preamble of the Paris Agreement recognizes the importance of striving toward gender equality and women's empowerment. And as Julio mentioned, Article 7 of the Paris Agreement on adaptation also recognizes the importance for adaptation action to be gender responsive. Gender was first included as part of the adaptation discussion in the Cancun adaptation framework when there was a call for adaptation to be gender sensitive. So we have seen progress in the negotiations around the issue of gender equality. Gender responsive action is critical for a number of reasons. First and foremost, it's about addressing that inequality. It's about recognizing that women are disproportionately vulnerable and they need to be part of identifying the solutions. They have critical knowledge to bring. It's also their right to be at the table. It's critical for sustainability so that we're ensuring that we're engaging all communities and all populations who are part of the solution so that they are helping shape it and we have their buy-in going forward. It's also incredibly important to factor gender into our examination of climate action so that we're developing solutions that meet the different needs. Women and men play very different roles in their households and in their communities, so they have different priorities and they have different needs. One piece of technology might work for a man, it may not work for a woman. because we've not looked at it through the gender lens. Under the UNFCCC, in addition to the Paris Agreement and the language, not just in the preamble, but also the adaptation article, we also have what was renewed last year in Marrakesh, the Lima Work Program on Gender. And that's designed to build parties' capacity around integrating gender into their climate action, but then also to develop a gender action plan for the UN Framework Convention itself. Ultimately, for parties, it's incredibly important as they go forward to ensure that there is consideration of gender beyond just vulnerabilities. For a long time, we've looked at women and girls as the vulnerable, but they also are critical players in solutions for climate action as we go forward. And that's about ensuring their participation, ensuring inclusion of their priorities, and ensuring actions that respond to their needs and their priorities. And as Katrina said, parties throughout the UNFCCC are already parties to other human rights treaties, including such treaties as the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. So what's echoed in the Paris Agreement and in the Sustainable Development Goals echoes many existing commitments for parties to the UNFCCC. The issue of gender inequality often plays out in the context of food security. Globally speaking, almost 800 million people are chronically hungry. We have almost 160 million children under 5 who are stunted. They're too short for their age because of malnutrition before the age of 2. And the impacts of climate change on agriculture are well known. It's one of the most, or the most vulnerable sector. The IPCC in AR5 recognized that when it comes to food security, climate change is going to impact not just food production, but every aspect of food security. How much food is available, how well people can access food, how well it's utilized and those nutrients are absorbed, and how stable food supplies are. Small-scale food producers are often on the front lines. They themselves don't often have access to the resources they need to cultivate resilient livelihoods, whether it's access to secure land tenure, extension services, financial services, markets, or climate information. And for women, that access is even less. The FAO has estimated that if women had equal access to resources as men, as many as 150 million people, fewer people would be chronically hungry. The Paris Agreement was a bit of a landmark in terms of food security. It's the first time that the entire concept of food security, not just food production, has been recognized within the UN Framework Convention process. At the same time, in 2015, the Sustainable Development Goals were agreed to, and there is a shared goal throughout the international community that we will end hunger and malnutrition by 2030. At the same time, agriculture is also a source of greenhouse gas emissions. So this is where you see a need for action to address the impacts, but also a need for action to make sure that we're addressing the fundamental problem. Agriculture and food security are where many of the challenges in climate action meet. This, in essence, puts the onus on parties, again, to make sure that when they're designing their climate action, they are starting with the concept of food security. Every one of us eats. This is something every single person on the planet can share. So in terms of mitigation, first and foremost, before we think about some of those risky, unproven technologies and approaches, we first and foremost have to shift the way that we are generating energy. We have to shift to 100% renewable energy. That's in our grasp, and that's the first thing that we need to be undertaking. When it comes to adaptation, again, we have to ensure that there's participation of the populations impacted. And that really applies for adaptation or mitigation, making sure that we're talking to the people who are impacted, whether it's their land, their livelihoods, their rights, or their resources. So it always comes back to this idea of starting with the principles that are in the Paris Agreement preamble and the underlying human rights frameworks that are part of and support those principles. And that applies to food security as well. The right to food is enshrined in more than one international human rights agreement. So when it comes to human rights going forward, it's about those principles in the Paris preamble. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tanya, for that first introduction to the importance of these principles and how they can be implemented in the context of these negotiations, but also at the domestic level. And you gave us some examples for that. So I would like to introduce our next speaker, Kitty Sack, who works, who's the chairperson of the Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact, and who is going to explain to us why the rights of indigenous peoples are important for climate action. And I wanted to also mention at the previous panel, we had, there were so many panelists. It was also an event about human rights. There were so many panelists that one of the speakers who also talked about indigenous issues initially didn't have a seat on the panel. And in that context, I think it's very important that Kitty Sack is here sitting in the middle of the panel, because I do think that the indigenous peoples for all of these discussions urgently need a seat at the table. So with that, I would like to turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. I just like to introduce myself a little bit. Yeah, my name is Kitty Sack, but my family name is quite long. Yeah, it's quite hard to pronounce. Yeah, Ratana Krachang Si. Yeah, so it's quite long. It's difficult. I belong to Mian people. I'm working with the Asia Indigenous People Pact and regional network of indigenous people in Asia. We have members in 14 countries in Asia. For us, the rights of indigenous people in the climate action is really important. As you know that indigenous people have been engaging in the climate negotiations for a long time. And at the beginning, we could not get anything. But we try hard and try to push really hard until we get something like our rights be recognized, like in the Cancun Agreement, in particular in the lead plus issues. That's the first time that we feel like that our rights been starting recognized by the UNFCCC framework. But I think that's a good starting point for us. But now in the Paris Agreement, like the previous speaker already mentioned, that our rights already mentioned, not just only in the preamble part, but also in the Article 7, in the adaptation part, and also we also have the paragraph 135 about the indigenous people platform on the knowledge sharing. So this for us is like a progress for the recognition of the rights of indigenous people. But before we, but still, a lot of challenging in terms of how to translate this thing into action on the ground. But before talking about this, I just like to go back a little bit about why indigenous peoples really want to participate in the climate change negotiation. The first thing, as you know, that indigenous peoples are the most vulnerable group that are facing the impact of climate change. We can say that we are in the front line of the climate change impact because our way of life mostly depending on the natural resources for our survival, for our livelihoods. And that the problems when something changes, like the temperature rise and many things change, that also affect to our way of life. So that the first problem. And then another thing is because we are a smaller group, we live really isolated areas. So our voice is hardly heard by the policymakers. So it's really difficult for us to voice out our concern. There are so many policies, so many development projects that coming to our lands, but we don't have any say to prevent this kind of impact. So this is related to the another issues. There are so many many measures that that the government also proposed to tackle the impact of climate change, like CDM projects and many things. That of course also many of them also pose a negative impacts to our livelihoods because they build this kind of project in our land, sometimes without our consent. That's also posing a lot of problem to us. So this kind of things we feel like that we should come and should participate in the international negotiations just to ensure that our rights will be respected and will be heard at the international level, and to ensure that those negative impacts will not happen in our lands and territories. So that's the idea. So we attended the global negotiations on climate change. At the beginning, quite a small group, but now we have more group, and then we are organized. We have the forum, indigenous people forum on climate change, where we can discuss and consolidate our strategy and actions to voice our concern to the parties. So with this, we think that it's quite important. And right now the issues, we think that how going to translate this issue into action. One thing, as we know that the UNFCCC also one of the UN agencies, and the UN General Assembly is also already adopted the United Nations on the Rights of Indigenous People. In 2013. That's no, it's 2007. Sorry. That's that UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is really important and can be used as a framework for implementation of this thing into action on the ground. So the UNFCCC is also one of them. So we believe that with this, the rights of indigenous people should be recognized, respected, and should be safeguarded on the ground. And also just like to conclude that the UNDRIP, even though it's not a combined, it's not a binding treaty, but also many issues in the UNDRIPs are already pulling out from the different international human rights instruments. Like the moderator also mentioned that those treaties are already binding. So implementing the UNDRIPs is also implementing the commitments of the state. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kitisak. And I should have said in my introduction that, of course, indigenous peoples do not only deserve a seat at the table, but also an important voice in these negotiations. And we are here in a side event, but I think you made a really strong case for why the rights of indigenous peoples should become a central part of the negotiations themselves. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Annabella Rosenberg, who works with the International Trade Unions Confederation and has been a part of the coalition that worked to bring human rights and the principle of a just transition into the Paris Agreement, and will talk to us about this. Over to you, Annabella.
Thanks, Katarina, and thank you, for the invitation. Even if I feel it's not really an invitation, this is just the continuation of our dialogue for the past 2 years that I'm so proud of. The ITUC, is the global trade union organization representing national confederations around the world. About 180 million workers are part of our movement, but more broadly, I think our spirit is to try to bring the voices of workers into different spaces, in this case, into the climate negotiations. Many of you might have probably already followed us in our endeavor for bringing rights into the negotiations, so I'll probably not spend myself too long into telling you why it's so important that to get just transitioning things. I just wanted probably to give you a little bit of that, but also a reaction to something that came to me a couple of times already this week, which is this idea that when we bring rights to the table, and I'm not just only talking about just transition, but more broadly, all our concerns, indigenous peoples, gender equality, bringing food security to the table, we are somehow putting a burden into a process that is already complex enough. So, well, okay, you had, guys, what you wanted in the text, so now you could a little bit stop bringing your things now with implementation. And I think it's, well, of course, I don't like that demand, but I think we need to make very clear that bringing rights to the table is not a burden for this process, is the enabler for ambition. What we keep on saying is that if we secure rights in the process, we can guarantee that governments, parties will be able to increase their ambition because they will have stronger social support, which is ultimately what is lacking on the ground. People that are convinced that climate action is about their lives, their livelihoods, their rights, their jobs. So because I had this kind of bitter taste from the week, I just wanted to share that with you. Of course, for us, rights, I mean, we are supportive of this coalition and the different aspects of rights, but we've been, of course, very strong calling for parties to recognize that if indeed, as we always say, there are no jobs on a dead planet, we have to fight also for the jobs that are being lost because of climate inaction. We also need to keep in mind the fact that the transition is not going to be easy, that there's nothing automatic when we think about job creation, and that there are many people there working on the fossil-based economy that might be the leftovers of a system that will soon be discarded. And we don't want people to be left on the margins, because then we know we can be used by irresponsible leaders as the shields for inaction. And we don't want our workers to be the excuse, because in the end, those who have the benefits, those who have wealth and power, will get the benefits using workers, and then they will very soon forget what these workers actually needed. So no worker should be put in a position of saying, I want my job or I have nothing. We want to start thinking from now, what is their alternative? What is their future? And that's what Just Transition is about. It's about a package of measures that will support workers and communities in the transition to a zero carbon economy. The Paris Agreement, I think for the first time recognized, the idea. Because I'm not a lawyer, I never made the difference between the preamble and the substance and the content of the agreement. I just say that parties committed to just transition. Because we are also in a post-truth society, I use that so that whatever we say is also part of reality. And I think it's very important. It's not that we say that the preamble and the rest is the same, but that we think that what parties have agreed to put in that agreement is as strong, no matter the place in which it has been put. I think we collectively have to believe that the preamble is not an under kind of a sub-thought in the agreement and the negotiation. So we have been developing, like many other colleagues, ideas on how could this be translated, of course, in the negotiations, but also elsewhere. Here it means bringing the concept of just transition, but more important, these employment pathways that come along with the climate goals into the NDCs, as it was said earlier by Julio. I mean, it's the critical part of the Paris Agreement. We want the goal, but we also want to know how parties will reach that goal and give a sense that they are assessing the jobs impact and how they are going to handle those impacts. So that's a critical part for us, because it will help us bringing this issue to the stocktake as being one of the elements of the dialogue. We are also working on other aspects that are related to the Green Climate Fund, seeing to what extent the Green Climate Fund can also enable transition projects to be funded on the ground. I mean, those communities that need support for transitioning could also find a way through the fund, and some technical work going on now on the sometimes a little bit not much loved response measures issue, but that we think we have managed to bring some positive inspiration into that group, and we are quite proud of that. So the last thing I wanted to say is that we very much see the trade union movement as part of this family. Those who have in the past wanted us to go just for our just transition beat, but dropping our brothers and sisters in different communities, in indigenous peoples, and with gender equality. I think we were very proud of standing strong with the human rights community, and all of us, I think we make a very solid group, standing for those who have sometimes strong voices, but not very well heard at the national level in particular. So we are very proud of being together. And we think that sticking together in what's coming, which might be a very difficult road for climate activists, it will be even more important. We are seeing this with environmental activists on the ground and human rights activists on the ground being attacked, putting their lives on the spot for standing for land rights, for forests, for their livelihoods. The times ahead are not going to be easy. And I think all of us who have and share the same principles here would also be asked, I think, to respond and stay solidly together in the years ahead. So thanks again for the opportunity, and stronger together.
Thank you very much, Annabella, and thank you also for raising the importance of the protection of environmental defenders around the world who've been killed, who've been threatened, and who are struggling to make their voices heard on these issues, including on climate action. So our next speaker is sitting next to me, Monica Camacho, who works with the Rainforest Foundation in Norway, and has worked also as a part of this coalition leading up to Paris on ecosystem integrity. And the floor is yours, Monica.
Thank you. I am Monica. I am Peruvian, and I work with Rainforest Foundation Norway. It is an NGO that works for the protection of the forest and indigenous people's rights. And we are very happy of being part of this coalition for human rights within the Paris Agreement. My presentation is about ecosystem integrity and human rights, and is structured in 4 parts. In the first part, I would like to address what the relationship between human rights and ecosystem integrity is. In the second part, we are going to discuss what the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals says regarding this topic. The third part is regarding the consequences of having mitigation actions that don't address ecosystems integrity. And the last one, what governments can do to ensure the integrity and resilience of natural ecosystems when implementing mitigation actions. So regarding the first part, the relationship between human rights and ecosystem integrity, we know that a healthy and sustainable environment are necessary conditions to the full and enjoyment of human rights, such as the rights to life, health, food, water. Maintaining and enhancing the integrity and resilience of the environment and ecosystems is critical for the long-term effectiveness of climate mitigation and adaptation actions. Healthy ecosystems sequester and store carbon, provide a natural defense against natural disasters such as floods and sea level rise, and support the livelihoods of billions of people. But when they are destroyed or degraded, ecosystems become a source of emissions, and their ability to enable people and other species to adapt is compromised. Actions to enhance ecosystem integrity and resilience will help countries achieve their mitigation and adaptation objectives and avoid climate responses that undermine progress towards these objectives. The second part, what the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals says regarding this topic. The Paris Agreement tasks countries with ensuring the integrity of all ecosystems and protecting biodiversity when taking action on climate change. This is a reference from the preamble, but it finds solid footing in Article 9 on finance and Article 7.5, which states that adaptation action should take into consideration communities and ecosystems. The importance of ensuring ecosystem integrity is also reflected in the Sustainable Development Goals, specifically the number 15, which establishes the goal of conservation and restoration of ecosystems, in particular forests, by 2020. What the consequences of having mitigation actions that don't consider, that don't take into account for the protection of ecosystems are? Mitigation and adaptation actions that don't adequately consider ecosystems may deliver minimal emissions reductions and exacerbate the vulnerability of people and ecosystems to the impacts of climate change. Poorly planned deployment of bioenergy, hydropower, and other climate responses are already driving ecosystem degradation and biodiversity loss. What governments can do and should do in this situation? For long-term sustainability of climate actions, governments should integrate their existing international obligations into national legislations. The obligation to ensure the integrity and resilience of natural ecosystems must be considered when deciding which, where, and how climate actions are to be undertaken at a national level. Governments should also require national institutions, investors, and other stakeholders to provide regular information on how they have considered the impact of their climate actions on natural ecosystems and the actions taken to avoid or mitigate those impacts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Monica. I want to give the floor to our last speaker, Erika Lennon, who is a senior attorney with the Center for International Environmental Law, one of the co-hosts of this panel. And the CIEL has also been instrumental in bringing together this coalition of groups working towards the Paris Agreement on human rights and related principles. And so Erika will now also discuss some of the very concrete proposals for integration into the APA.
Thanks, Katrina. Hi, everyone. Thank you all for coming, and thanks to all the panelists for being here. So I'm going to first touch on one last sort of the procedural rights or the rights, and then I'll go into the specific recommendations for the APA. So one of the rights that has been mentioned by a number of panelists and that sort of underscores everything is public participation. Because if you don't have the public involved, you're not going to get as good climate action. So Principle 10 of the Rio Declaration, which is a key tenet of international environmental law, recognizes that everyone has a right to access of information, access to justice, and access to participation. And it's not just good enough to have participation in like, oh, hey, we invited them to a meeting and we did it an hour ahead of time and none of the documents were available and they were all in English or all in a language that no one speaks. You need meaningful participation and you need effective participation. And you need to make sure that you're creating spaces in which the public can participate and that all parts of the public can participate. It's not good enough to just talk to the elders, or you need to make sure you're talking to women, that you're talking to youth, that you're talking to indigenous peoples, that you're talking to marginalized communities and local communities, because that's how you're truly going to ensure public participation and help get meaningful action on climate change. So the right to public participation is recognized in the UNFCCC, it's recognized in the Paris Agreement. And all climate actions and the climate actions we can take in the Paris Agreement will be strengthened and be made better and it will strengthen the legitimacy and effectiveness of climate responses if the public is able to participate. not only does there need to be public participation in the halls here and at the UNFCCC negotiations and people having a voice here, as a number of my fellow panelists have mentioned, but it has to be back in the countries and in the creation of the nationally determined contributions and in the creation of the adaptation plans, because it's only by consulting the people in the country and the communities and the local communities and the impacted people that it's going to make better policy. It's going to make there be public buy-in. It's going to reduce conflict. It helps get public support, and it helps the public have ownership of what the climate actions are and of how a country is going to meaningfully address climate change, so that you don't leave behind, or that you don't leave behind the workers, that you don't leave behind women, that you take into the consideration how local communities think they can best address climate change, so that you rely on indigenous and traditional knowledge. And so really all of these rights and all of this action is benefited by having meaningful early throughout public participation in developing both the policies here and the frameworks here, but also in developing the climate actions that are going to help address the problem for mitigation, both mitigation and adaptation. So now I'm going to sort of transition and talk about how to take all of what we've just spoken about and integrate them into the Paris Agreement, and really make sure, and integrate them into the Paris Rulebook, and really make sure that we can operationalize the text in the preamble, and not just like have it be a pretty statement in the preamble. So in this report that we're releasing today, we've sort of focused on 4 key areas of the Paris Agreement and where rights can come in. That's not to say that this is the only place where we should consider human rights in the UNFCCC or in the Paris Agreement. It's just to say that these are 4 of the areas that we've identified, partially because they're integrated and they're cyclical. And if you get rights into there, we think that will be hugely beneficial. So the 4 key areas that we've sort of focused on are nationally determined contributions, the adaptation communications, the transparency framework, and the global stocktake. And part of this is that if you think about it, if you incorporate rights and reporting on rights and public participation into the NDCs and into the adaptation communications, those inform what you report on in the transparency framework. The transparency framework informs what is in the global stocktake on the collective, on what everyone is collectively doing to address this problem. And the global stocktake then informs the next round of NDCs and adaptation communications, and it keeps going and building. So in both the NDCs and the adaptation communications, not only, so it's important to, so I'll start with the NDCs. And when you're developing your NDCs, it would be important, and so part of this is that when we're developing the guidelines in the Paris Rulebook, and they're developing the guidelines for what should go in the NDCs and the adaptation communications, we're hoping, or we think that they should specify that it should go beyond just what your quantified emissions targets are and go beyond your support actions, to also include how implementation is going to respect and promote the principles and the rights that everyone on this panel has mentioned. It is also important, as I mentioned, that the NDC should be produced with the full and effective participation of civil society, including marginalized groups, including indigenous peoples, including women, including girls, including youth, including workers, including migrants, because that's how you can really figure out the best way to address climate change and how to act. And when you're reporting on your NDC, so you should include how you've included these people, and the same goes for adaptation communications. And the NDC should report on how it's going to respect and promote these rights, and how the mitigation actions are going to relate to ambition, and how lower ambition impacts human rights, and how its actions will take into account sustainable development and food security and the right to water and a just transition and ecosystem integrity and indigenous people's rights and gender equality and sort of everything we've been talking about. The same is true in the adaptation communications. I think a number of people have already mentioned Article 7.5, which brings in the concept that it should be gender responsive and participatory, and be based on best available science and include traditional and indigenous knowledge. And so not only should adaptation plans be produced in this way, when you're reporting in your adaptation communications, you should also include information on how you're respecting these rights and on how you engaged in this participatory process. Because it's one thing to say, yes, 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 we talked to all of the people, but it would really be to ensure that participation actually happened. Countries should have to report on how they've engaged with their citizens and how they've engaged with the people in developing these plans. And so if you do all of that, then in your transparency framework, the transparency framework is all about promoting trust and accountability and sharing good practices. And in order to do this, it needs to be holistic. And you can't just report on your emissions accounting, and you can't just report on your finance transfers and on your support. But it should also report on rights obligations in climate action and promote sustainable development. And the guidelines for the transparency framework should reflect this. And then additionally, in drafting these sort of national reports and the communications that will go in of the transparency framework, you should ask for public comment, and the public should be able to participate, because oftentimes you will get better information not just talking to certain people, but if you allow for more people to come in, you have more comprehensive information and it's more inclusive, and it's better for understanding truly what the actions are doing and how it's going. And then lastly, this should all feed into the global stocktake. So obviously the global stocktake is a review not of individual countries' actions, but of the collective progress towards implementation of the Paris Agreement. And part of implementing the Paris Agreement is respecting rights. And really recognizing that people are should be at the center of climate action, because people are the ones being impacted by climate change. And so in the global stocktake, it should also include implications for what the collective ambition level is. So we all know, we can see the NDCs, we know whether or not that's going to get us to 1.5. It's not, but it needs to, because we've all recognized that it needs to get us to keeping temperatures below 1.5, well below 2 degrees, ideally 1.5. And so in the global stocktake, it should look at what the ambition level is and whether or not this ambition level is going to get us there, but also how that is going to impact human rights and the associated principles that everyone's talking about. So what does it mean if our ambition level is too low for food security and for the right to food? What does it mean for the right to water? How is it going to affect indigenous peoples? How is it going to affect women and girls? How is it going to affect youth? And so in the global stocktake, you can't just review sort of climate action quantitatively, but it also has to be in line with the principles of the preamble. And as I've mentioned numerous times, it should include stakeholders. The global stocktake shouldn't just include countries and negotiators. It should include civil society. It should include intergovernmental organizations, and they should have a role in the global stocktake and be able to both provide information and participate in reflecting on how actions are being taken, on how the Paris Agreement is being implemented. Because it's important to show how this climate action, how climate action is contributing to fulfilling these social principles and fulfilling and promoting and respecting the human rights obligations that, as we mentioned, the countries have all signed on to. And so there should really be a holistic approach, and it should incorporate sustainable development. So basically, so we have this report that I will show. We do not have a bajillion copies because it's just finished. There is a website called deliveringonparis.com where you can download the report, and it will have, they're not all quite up there yet, links to sort of some of the underlying agreements that we rely on in the report as we're talking about where the rights come from and other things. So you can link to those. But so basically, to sum up, we really think that the principles and human rights and everything in the preamble should be incorporated into the Paris Rulebook. And that as we develop the guidelines for the Paris Rulebook, because that's really what we're doing, because the Paris Agreement, as you mentioned, is a number of articles, but we don't know quite yet how it's going to work. And so as we figure out how it's going to work, we really think that human rights and the principles and all the rights mentioned here should be integrated into it, and that all processes should be transparent and inclusive and guarantee effective public participation, because that will make the entire process better and help us better implement the Paris Agreement and really bring the climate action that we all need.
Thank you very much, Erica. Thanks to you and all the speakers who have actually respected the times allocated to them. I'm happy to report that now we have half an hour for discussion with our audience. And if someone who's sitting on that side of the room could get the blue catch box so we can open it up to the floor. And I would say we take 3 questions.
Yeah.
And then we give it back to the speakers. So there's one question here in the first
safe.
Thank you, Annabella.
Well, thank you to everyone for really good presentations. I just want to test out an idea I have, and maybe Julio and Erica could respond, since they mentioned Article 7, Paragraph 5. If I recall, and I don't have the language right in front of me, it says use of indigenous people's knowledge as appropriate. The determination of whether it's appropriate seems to me to implicate rights of indigenous peoples in and of itself. I mean, that's my view, and I'd just be interested in hearing your response to that idea.
Thanks, Kim. Another question in the back.
Listo?
Does this thing actually work? Oh my God, it does. Okay. Peter Riggs with Pivot Point. Some of you who were involved with the advocacy at Paris will remember we tried very hard, we collectively, to get this language, what we called operational language, the language that ended up in the preamble. It mattered a lot at the time. We wanted to see it in Article 2. It ended up being blocked and being in the preamble. My question is, I haven't heard a suggestion that it actually makes a difference in terms of the guidance given. And I mean, we have the text of 7.5, which is an obligation to report on. So I am curious about how you make the argument, a legal argument, that the preambular language is as operational as something found elsewhere in the agreement. And then if I may, I was struck by the fact, you know, if we had had a side event like this 2 years ago, I think the conversation would have been very strongly focused on safeguards. And I didn't hear anybody talk about safeguards at this. And I'm not saying you should have, but I'm just interested that the discourse seems to have moved so strongly away from safeguards. I mean, wanted to comment on why and if there are tactical reasons for that. Thanks.
Thank you, Peter. I'm sure there are many panelists who will want to respond to that. I think the discussion about safeguards is not over. Is there a third question in the room in the back? Yes.
Hi. He was completely oblivious. That was close. My name is Jesse Worker with the World Resource Institute, and I wanted to ask specifically, following up on procedural rights at the national level. One of the things that we've been doing, we're working within the open government partnership space, where there are 75 countries that are committed towards using open government to improve the quality of service delivery, implementation of policies to meet SDGs. And more recently, during our co-chairship period this year with the government of France, we've been encouraging countries to use open government commitments around climate action to strengthen the implementation of their NDCs, make the planning and implementation processes more inclusive, to best use open data platforms for climate in ways that make them most usable and effective, and so forth. We have created a working group of where there's 8 countries, and Julio is familiar with this because Chile has joined the working group along with 7 other countries. But the thing about the OGP process, I think that's relevant for the folks in this room, is that it's a co-creation process. So civil society and governments co-create action plans and develop commitments on open government, which are then independently evaluated to see how well they've been implemented. We think there's potential here for OGP to contribute and complement a rights-based approach for particularly for procedural rights in the UNFCCC. And I'd love to hear from the panelists on one of the, I think the key challenges is to help countries create commitments that are ambitious and actionable and targeted. So we have a clear sense of what success looks like, and thinking about something as critically important as public participation for climate policies. And I think that Erica laid it out very well. But I also think that some of that evaluating its effectiveness of how well it's been implemented, I think there's always been difficulties and challenges with the subjectiveness of how we determine that and how we get good, evaluation of that. I would love to hear from the panelists what you think in a forum like the OGP, what kind of ambitious commitments countries could make at the national level to really implement strong procedures for transparent and inclusive NDC implementation and planning. Thank you.
Thank you for those questions. So who would like to start? Monica?
I would like to take the question from Peter. From a legal point of view, a treaty has two parts, can we say? The preamble and the part with the legal binding obligations that is included after the preamble, the articles, because a preamble doesn't have articles. But and I would say that 3 comments regarding that. First, the principles in the preamble are in some way cutting principles of the Paris Agreement. And from a legal perspective, when we have an agreement and there is uncertainty or there is doubt about the meaning of one article, or maybe can be 1 or 2 or 3 possible interpretations of an article, what lawyers do is to try to interpret that article in the content of the preamble. So if we have 2 interpretations that maybe contradict each other, we have to take the one that is in accordance with the preamble. So in that regard, let's say that we have a possible interpretation of one of the articles of the Paris Agreement, and maybe there are one group of parties that would like to implement mitigation actions that are that can affect human rights or indigenous people's rights and other vulnerable groups. It shouldn't be possible from a legal perspective because we have a preamble that illuminates the content of the whole treaty. And the second point, more practical one, is that we see that in the negotiations, we have agenda items for mitigation, we have an agenda item for adaptation, for finance, but we don't have an agenda item for human rights or those cross-cutting principles of the Paris Agreement. So for that reason as well, it is important that we try to include those principles in all possible sections, because otherwise it will disappear. With the other topics, we know that we will get a result, but with the cutting principles of the preamble, if we don't push for the inclusion of them in NDCs, in finance, in the global stock take, in the different items, they can disappear.
Yes, no, thank you. They are excellent questions, and I don't have an answer for everything, of course. And probably there are people in the room like Monica that just explained what I was poorly going to explain in a very plain terms. But I just wanted to recall that in the run-up to Paris, and this relates to the location, the placement of human rights language in preamble against to in the operative part of the agreement. In the run-up to Paris, we had a number of iterations of text. And you might remember that when we got to Paris, the mentions to human rights were in 3 parts, in the preamble, in Article 2, and in adaptation. There were 3 mentions to human rights. And we fought hard to keep them But the negotiation is like this: you have to give away something and receive something in return. And there were various combinations that were explored, but at the end of the day, we ended up with the mention on the preamble. But Article 2 in the draft of the Paris Agreement was in the very core of the objective of the Paris Agreement. So that would have been a huge difference. So Article 2, as it stands now, refers to the three, mitigation, adaptation, means of implementation, and does not make any reference to human rights. So just for a moment, imagine if we would have succeeded in this, and if we had an Article 2 refers to all these global goals in adaptation, mitigation, and means of implementations that are based on human rights. That would be incredible. That would have been an incredible achievement, and we didn't get it. But so we have this very important mention in the preamble that, as Monica was saying, I think is a recognition of the human rights as a cross-cutting issue that illuminates the interpretation of what we are actually trying to achieve in the Paris Agreement. The other thing is about indigenous peoples. Of course, I'm not maybe. Kitisaki is more entitled than me to respond to this, but in my opinion, indigenous people's right is one of those areas where we need to really sit down and discuss about it, because it has almost no development whatsoever in the convention, and it is a great debt that we have especially now that we are entering a phase of implementation. And this relates very much with the last statement from Jesse, that in fact, we do need to match our transparency policies and openness and participation policies with the way we formulate our climate policies. And of course, the Open Government Partnership is going to be a very important platform for achieve that. But again, the same as the human rights mentioned in the Paris Agreement refers to the existing obligations of states and governments to international agreements on human rights. The same thing should be applicable to transparency. I mean, why singling out climate change as one particular area where you need a special treatment for participation? It should be open to all, just simple as that. And this, of course, has a lot to do with the general implementation of Principle 10 of the Rio Declaration that applies to all environmental issues, with the only exception maybe that, as I always try to underline, climate change is not only an environmental issue, it's more than that. So, but in this case, I would apply Principle 10 entirely to this aspect of NDCs. Thank you.
Thank you. Any of you? Is that?
Maybe later.
Later, okay. Anyone who wants to respond to the question about safeguards?
And if you don't, I'll briefly mention the GCF and then give it to you.
Okay.
If that works.
Yeah.
I think everyone has said all of everything I would have said on the legal aspects, including that, as mentioned at the beginning, all of the countries have signed up to a number of human rights frameworks. They all abide by Principle 10, and so why should we not include that here? In regards to safeguards, I would be happy to talk about safeguards at almost any time. I talk about safeguards in much of my life, working on development finance. And one thing I'll say is that the safeguards conversation is very much still alive in the Green Climate Fund. So currently the Green Climate Fund, right now there's a call out reviewing their gender action plan, but there's also earlier this year, they released a draft set of the environmental and social framework. So not necessarily the specific sort of environmental and social safeguards. So like not the individual ones on labor and not the systems. They're still using the IFC performance standards for that as their sort of interim safeguards. But they did do a public call for comment on an environmental and social framework. It does include human rights, at least the draft does. And so a number of civil society organizations, including CIEL, responded to that and sort of gave our input because I strongly believe that safeguards are important, and that as you're developing actions, particularly any sort of projects, any sort of adaptation projects or mitigation projects, there have to be safeguards in that protect the communities and the environment, because otherwise, what's the point of the actions?
And, just to add on to that, and I think Erica alluded to it, perhaps without intending to, safeguards are usually attached to finance, whether it's the World Bank, the GCF, the Red Plus mechanism. But when we're thinking about human rights and the integration of human rights and the principles in the Paris Preamble throughout climate action, it's not just what's attached to finance that we want to adhere to those principles and those human rights. It's a universality issue. So it's not an either or question. There are cases where we need to make sure the safeguards framework is incredibly robust, but at the same time, we want to make sure that there is that criteria for human rights. And just very quickly on the as appropriate question, I think that phrase often does raise concern, again, as a potential means of getting around this concept of universality. That's when I often look at human rights as a package. It isn't necessarily about cherry picking which human rights we're looking at adhering to and which aspects of indigenous people's rights we're looking at adhering to. It is the entire package. And so that's when looking at it that way, that hopefully enables us to not be caught in the as appropriate phrase.
So we do have time, unless any of you wants to comment now, we do have time for one more round of questions. I don't know where our blue box is at the moment. Can you pass that on to the person in the back, the side? Yes.
Yes, great panel, great presentation. Thank you. My name is Alain Frechette. I'm with the Rights and Resource Initiative. I have a basic question. Tenure rights, tenure security, and resource rights are fundamental to everything that we heard today. And but only one panelist mentioned tenure security in passing, tenure rights in passing. And I just went through the report, and it's barely mentioned. We just talk about land rights here. I think there's one or two mentions, and that's it. Any comments or reasons why we haven't touched on this, and suggestions for how it can be better incorporated, integrated into the Paris Rule Book? Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions in the room? Not at the moment. So maybe we'll turn that question over to the panel. Monica, do you want to respond?
Thanks for your question. It is, we know that there are many studies that show that if we achieved the recognition of indigenous people's rights over their territories and resources, those areas that have clear tenure rights for indigenous peoples are the areas that have where we see, for example, less deforestation, and are the areas that have more forests and more biodiversity. And that is important to keep us, to avoid climate change. So that is a concept, that is a topic that we here in the panel are conscious about, and we will update that the policy briefing to make it clear the importance, of tenure rights and indigenous people's rights, especially because the objective with this policy briefing is it is not a fast concluded document. We have a version online, and our objective is to update the document, to get your feedback, your comments, what topics are missing, and to keep it changing, and according how the negotiations are moving as well. And for example, especially in the case of forest protection, that I know it is a topic that Arari works a lot with, we see that especially in the tropics and in many developing countries where there is a huge population of indigenous people's rights and forest, there there is a lack of policies that recognize the importance of the job that indigenous peoples and other forest-dependent communities do, and the relationship between the importance of securing their rights, their eternal rights, with the achievement of emissions reductions, with the achievement of rights in general. So we will improve that part of the briefing to make it clear. Thank you.
So Annabella also wanted to comment on that or respond to a previous question.
Question for my colleagues. So probably there's the issue of land tenure that someone of you, will certainly respond much better than I. But my question to the panel, and also, to you, Katrina, is, when you think about where we are now, we have the 18 months from Paris, and your expectations on where we would be after the breakthroughs, to some extent, that we've made on these issues, how you assess where we are now in the negotiation, in advancing the issues. Are we on the different elements? Are we on a green light, like, okay, things are moving slowly, but the moving is more like cautious yellow. Well, we've seen much more, consensus in moving our agenda forward than what we expected, or is kind of red lightish situation? Because I have the feeling that, okay, we worked well together, but we might not be supporting each other enough in the process of getting our demands reflected, and even more walking into the next COP. So probably that would be my question to the panel.
So who wants to respond first? Or to the previous question also, you can comment on either this or the previous questions. Kitisak?
Yeah, still don't know where we are now. but for us, I think that at least for us, we have, like, right now, the platform where we are going to discuss next week, and in the multi-stakeholder dialogue. So that, I think that one of the concrete proposal for indigenous people, once that platform is clearly established, we think that that will be our forum where we can discuss and share our experiences. And of course, we can also make use of that forum to advise the parties on how to integrate the traditional knowledge in the climate change actions. So for us, even though it's slow, but at least for us, we think that we have something to work on. That's the but I don't know how far it will go. But if we think that by COP23, this platform will be finalized, that probably for us is probably a little bit more progress for indigenous people.
Tonya?
I'll try to respond to both questions. I think on the land rights question, it comes up as part of food security because it's such an enabling right for the right to food, particularly for small scale food producers. And I would say that if we had expanded the document to a longer length, it also would have been woven into the gender section, because women often do not enjoy equal access to land rights with men. So I think it would have been woven in much more in perhaps a lengthier document, because it is part and parcel of so many aspects of the human rights framework that we're talking about. On where we are on the traffic light, I'm going to say we're yellow. I think there's broad awareness of how important it is to begin looking holistically at how climate action happens, particularly when we now have a matrix of 17 SDGs. And I very explicitly used the word matrix, not list. At the same time, I think there are also so many technical issues that are also part of these negotiations, whether it's in the transparency framework, the global stocktake, or the subs to agriculture negotiations. Everything is quite technical. So the onus is on us to continue the drumbeat around the importance of continuing to recognize that these rights are fundamental, not just to the people whose rights they are, but also to our ability to deliver on climate action.
Erica?
I'll try and respond. I agree with Tanya on sort of where we are. It's always hard to assess. I'll note one thing, that in the first round of NDCs that were submitted before Paris, even though governments were not required to necessarily put in any information, a number of them did reference human rights, indigenous peoples, public participation, food security, and gender equality. So this is obviously something that they can do. It is obviously something at least some governments recognize was an important part of the NDCs. And we think it's an important part of the NDCs going forward and sort of in this whole process. And so I think we can build on that. I also think that, the fact that we are continuing to have these conversations, that we are not just talking about rights in the context of finance and safeguards, I think is important, that we're talking about it more holistically and cross-cutting. Just before this event in this room, the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights held an event and the room was packed. The Executive Secretary, Patricia Espinoza, was here. I think that's a good sign. On this past Monday, there was a presidential, I don't remember what we called it, a presidential briefing on child rights and the importance of the rights of the child related to climate change. And I think all of these are positive signs that this message is getting through. I don't think we're there yet. I think as we're in these technical negotiations, I think there's a lot of work to be done. But I think that, all of us working together and doing things like producing this briefing note, which did leave out important things for sake of needing to not have it be a hundreds of pages long, a tome. This is all part of the negotiations, and I think we're going to stick with it, and we're going to keep updating and keep talking about it and keep talking to negotiators over the next sort of 18 months as we develop the Paris rulebook, and hopefully the light will go from sort of yellow to green. Yes. But a lot of that onus is on the negotiators, yes, and on us.
You still want to say something? Yeah.
Yes, very, very briefly. I'm relatively new in the negotiations. I've been here 5 years in the process, and in these 5 years, I've seen a very, very yellowy scenario most of the time. And this is, I guess, something that relates to the dynamics of the negotiation, where countries or government parties prefer to hold to their positions until the very end, and this is why we spend very long nights in the COPs, and we end up losing good time of sleep, waiting for that final piece that is necessary to achieve a consensus. So that's one thing, and let's not forget that the APA probably is going to be finalized into 2018, and therefore we need to also, since these are cross-cutting issues, we need to look more into the future and what kind of areas of discussion we will have in the CMA when the CMA start working properly, and we don't have this strange parallelism due to the early entry into force of the Paris Agreement. So it is very important that we keep discussing these issues, because this is precisely the moment where we need to have a common understanding of what we mean. What did we intend by including human rights in the preamble and in the Paris Agreement? So even if in the formal negotiations we don't have an agenda item or a specific space, it is very important that both non-state actors and negotiators continue talking about this, because I am sure that many negotiators will see with some reluctance still the discussion on human rights, considering that they might perceive it as a sort of a strange issue or unusual issue that enters into the negotiation. So it is very important that we continue discussing this and feed into the discussion that we will eventually have, hopefully sooner than later, in the context of the CMA.
Thank you. And the last word for Monica, very briefly, we are running out of time.
Just a short comment. I would say that at least in this session, from my perspective, I would say that it is more yellow-red because we are not hearing negotiators in the formal meetings. We are not hearing in this session that they are mentioning human rights. And for example, in the last one in Marrakesh, we had some countries that were talking about human rights, but not in this session. And I think, but we see that many countries as Costa Rica, Peru, Brazil, Colombia have mentioned human rights and the importance of human rights, indigenous people's rights, and other topics in their NDCs. So I encourage you to talk with the delegates of your countries, with the negotiators that you know at this meeting, to encourage them, especially to the ones that have mentioned this issue in their NDCs, to do that also openly in the formal meetings, because it is important to incentivize other countries.
Thank you very much, Monica. And I want to thank all our panelists for really excellent presentations on a very, very rich discussion and all your responses. Special thanks goes to Julio Cordano from the government of Chile for being here with us, because as you mentioned, Monica, I think it's important that these discussions are not only happening among observers, but we have these discussions with parties. And so that's really encouraging, I think, especially because we've heard from a number of people here that maybe we're on yellow or even slightly red. So there's really the need to act on this now and to think about very concrete proposals. I also want to thank you all, the audience here in the room, the audience online, for your excellent questions, for your engagement on this issue. And I hope that we can continue the conversation just after the event, or also, of course, in the coming months and years. So thank you very much to all of you.
Oh, were you? Okay, with Elmira. No, with Clement and Claire. Yes.